Wamba was the king of the Visigoths from 672 to 680. During his reign the Visigothic kingdom encompassed all of Hispania and part of southern Gaul, known as Septimania. According to Herwig Wolfram, Wamba means big paunch in Gothic and may have been a nickname. Both Julian of Toledo in his Historia Wambae and the decisions of the 11th Council of Toledo, held under Wamba's auspices, only refer to the king as Wamba. History. Military events. Some weeks after ascending the throne in 672, Wamba had to face a revolt from Hilderic, governor of Nîmes, who had himself aspired to the kingship. Hilderic was supported by Gunhild, bishop of Maglon. Wamba sent the Dux Paul to put down the rebels, but upon his arrival at Narbonne, Paul became a rebel himself, inducing his officers to renounce their loyalty to Wamba and elect him king as Flavius Paulus. He was joined by Hilderic and his followers, as well as by Duke Ranocindus of Tarraconensis and the guarding Artus Hildigisus. Paul further attempted to improve his chances by recruiting multitudes of Franks and Basques to join his forces. With this, the Visigothic cities in Gaul and a large part of northeastern Hispania came over to Paul's side. When this happened, Wamba was in Cantabria campaigning against the Basques. In response, Wamba marched into the Tarraconensis region, and in a few days turned most of the cities back to his side. He then divided his forces into three groups, attacking over the Pyrenees by way of Livia, Auch, and the coastal road, taking the fortresses of Callao, Volterraria, and Livia, and finding much gold and silver there. When Wamba moved on Narbonne, Paul placed a general Witima over that city and retired himself to Nîmes. But Wamba's forces quickly subdued Narbonne and then, after some difficulty, secured the surrender of Nîmes on September 3, 673. This included the surrender of Paul and the other rebel leaders who, 3 days later, were brought to trial and, for the crimes, scalped and imprisoned for life. A period of peace followed and, in 674, Wamba rebuilt the Roman walls around Toledo. He also fortified other sites about this time, possibly Hondarribia, a small village in Spain on a little promontory facing the French border over the Teking Bay. Since a military thrust along the Bay of Biscay up to the Pyrenees is attested in contemporary sources. Also during his reign, Wamba brought the Astures and Raccoons under his control and incorporated them into a new province. They had been fighting for their independence since the Visigothic invasions of the 5th century, but now finally relented. But the initial rebellion may have weakened the kingdom and thus opened the door to a new foe, Saracen raiders. 200 years later, the Chronicle of Alfonso III said, in Wamba's time, 270 Saracen ships attacked the coast of Hispania and there all of them were burned. A single attack of this size is doubtful, however, because no other source mentions it. The Chronicle of 754 declares Moors had long been raiding Andalusia and simultaneously devastating many cities. However, the Chronicle of 754's most recent English translator, Kenneth Baxter Wolfe, holds that this refers to the year before the defeat of King Roderick by the Moors, over 3 decades after the removal of Wamba. Indeed, the law books and decrees of the time reveal a substantial erosion of domestic tranquility and order, further shaking up the diverse kingdom. In the Visigothic law books, Wamba decrees that all the people, regardless of the religion and even if they are clergy, are required to defend the kingdom if it is attacked by a foreign foe. This law was created to solve a problem of desertion, for, whenever an enemy invades the provinces of our kingdom, those who inhabit the border disappear so that, by this means, there is no mutual support in battle. This rationale may imply a frequency of raids, that the people were often unwilling to defend the kingdom, as further shown by another of Wamba's edicts, one in which slaves were freed in order to fill the ranks of the army. This suggests not only a shortage of volunteers from among the Hispano-Romans who made up the bulk of the population ruled by the Visigothic lords, but also an army heavy in conscripts of the coerced. In 680, Wamba Felila was poisoned in Pamplona, near Burgos, received the Order of Penance in anticipation of death, and as a result was forced to step down as king upon his recovery. The Chronicle of Alfonso III blames Wamba's successor Herwig for this. Some modern commentators have blamed Julian of Toledo, who was made primate of the Visigothic Church by Herwig, but Julian perpetuated the memory of Wamba in his account of the revolt of Paul, Historia Wambae Regis. Religious events. In 675 the Third Council of Braga was held in Braga, Hispania. This Catholic conclave promulgated 8 decrees affecting ritual, the handling of sacred vessels, who may and may not live with a priest, unacceptable forms of punishment of clergy, and unacceptable forms of payment of clergy in rectors. In the same year, the 11th Council of Toledo was convened in November. Wamba was a reformist king who, according to Charles Julian Bisco, tried to set up at Aquis in Lusitania a monastic see of the same type as Dume Braga, i.e. involving the sort of episcopus subregular associated with early pactualism. This maneuver was successfully blocked by the Metropolitan Church of Emerita with the full support of the Fathers of the 12th Council of Toledo. Legend. Birthplace. Wamba was, according to one tradition, born in Egatania, a modest village surrounded by Roman walls that is today called Idana Ravella and located to the northeast of Castelo Branco in Portugal. A Spanish tradition has him born in Galicia in the parish of Santa Maria de Dozon in an old house with a shield. Manuel de Sousa da Silva, a 17th-century Portuguese genealogist, in his work Nobiliario das Jericas de Ontraduro e Minho, refers this possibility, adding that he was of the lineage of the Gothic kings, but support that he was a farmer. Modern genealogists make him a son of Tulga, a possibility sustained by the fact of his being a humble man of royal descent, since his father was deposed at a young age and when his own sons were still infants. The most famous tradition, however, has him born and raised in Pujera in the Malaga province, an Andalusian mountain village, nestled amid forests of chestnut trees, near the Genil River in southern Spain. Nearby are the ruins of Molino de Capilla, close to which once lay the village of Cini, which a few say was the actual birthplace. Kingship. There are at least 2 legends associated with how Wamba became king. One begins with Wamba's father, king of the Visigoths, who in this story was also named Wamba. 2 women of his court, a servant girl and a noble lady, suspiciously became pregnant at the same time. So, to avoid a scandal that might implicate the king, particularly regarding the noble lady, both women were forced to flee the capital. They somehow found the way to the Andalusian village which, because it was so well hidden in the forest, provided an ideal place for secret births. After some months both women brought forth boys, and both boys were placed in the servant girl's care to be raised in that remote area. Many years rolled by. Then, when the time came to groom a successor for the king, there seemed to be no suitable heir. But the king, or someone at court, remembered the 2 illegitimate children. So soldiers were dispatched to the village to find the one who was the royal heir. Shortly after their arrival amid the chestnuts, they overheard a peasant woman call to her son. His name was Wamba. Immediately the soldiers knew they had come upon the youth they sought. He was tending cattle with a stick. The soldiers approached and declared, "You are the rightful king and we must ask you to come with us to the palace." But Wamba was unwilling, or at least pretended to be, so he took his stick and thrust it into the ground, saying, "I will only accept the throne if this stick takes root." The stick he carried, however, was of chopo, a black poplar, which easily takes root in fertile soil. Thus, when it began to grow, Wamba agreed to go with the soldiers to become the new king of the Visigoths, being elected and crowned in what is today the tiny village of Wamba in the region around Madrid. A second legend is related by Charles Morris in Historical Tales, The Romance of Reality, Spanish. In this version, instead of being a boy, Wamba was an old man of the village, owning land and possessions there. The year was 672. In those days, when a king died and left no son, the Goths elected a new one, seeking the best and worthiest, and holding the election in the place where the old king had died. It was in the little village of Gerticos, some 8 miles from the city of Valladolid, that King Reselwinto had sought health and found death. Hither came the electors, the great nobles, the bishops, and the generals, and here they debated who should be king. St. Leo, declaring he had been given divine guidance, instructed the electors to seek out a husbandman named Wamba. So scouts were dispersed throughout the land until, at length, Wamba was found tilling one of his fields. "Leave your plough in the furrow," they said to him. "Nobler work awaits you. You have been elected king of Hispania." "There is no nobler work," answered Wamba. "Seek elsewhere your monarch. I prefer to rule over my fields." The astonished heralds knew not what to make of this. To them the man who would not be king must be a saint, or an idiot. They reasoned, begged, implored, until Wamba, anxious to get rid of them, said, "I will accept the crown when the dry rod in my hand grows green again, and not till then." Then a miracle happened. After he thrust it into the ground, all were astonished to see it suddenly become a green plant with leaves growing out of the top. Heaven had decided the matter. So Wamba went with the heralds to the electoral congress. Once there, however, he again tried to refuse the throne. At this, one of the Visigothic chieftains drew his sword and threatened to behead Wamba if he didn't accept the crown. Wamba relented and consented. The legend of the stick thrust into the ground is also associated with the town of Guimarães, southwest of Braga in the Costa Verde of Portugal. Because Wamba never withdrew the stick afterwards, it is said it grew into an olive tree. Though the tree is now gone, the site is marked either by the monastery of Nossa Senhora da Oliveira of the Lago da Oliveira town square, each named for the legendary tree. St. Giles. In a 10th century life of St. Giles, written for the benefit of pilgrims, a legend is recorded about how, one day, when King Wamba was out hunting in the forest between Arles and Nîmes in Provence, he began to pursue a hind. The animal fled, seeking refuge in the cave where Giles the hermit was quietly praying. Wamba shot his arrow into the opening, but he missed the hind, striking Giles instead, wounding him in the leg and causing a permanent disability. The king's hunting dogs then rushed in for the kill. But when Wamba arrived, he found his dogs miraculously rooted to the spot. Discovering what he had done, he begged forgiveness and tried to make amends. But Giles continued his prayers, refusing all help or recompense. The king nonetheless had doctors care for the wound. He also offered Giles the land upon which to build a monastery. But Giles refused. Over time, however, because of the saint's fame as a sage and miracle worker, multitudes gathered at his cave. So, around 674, Wamba built them a monastery. Giles became its first abbot. Soon a little town grew up there, known as St. Giles du Gard. Because of this tradition, Giles became the patron saint of cripples, lepers, and nursing mothers. His emblem is an arrow. The Catholic Encyclopedia notes that the king in this story must have originally been a Frank, since the Franks had expelled the Visigoths from the neighborhood of Nîmes almost a century and a half earlier. Loss of the crown. Charles Morris writes that, during Wamba's reign, one ambitious noble named Paul, who thought it would be an easy thing to take the throne from an old man who had shown so plainly that he did not want it, rose in rebellion. He soon learned his mistake. Wamba met him in battle, routed his army, and took him prisoner. Paul expected nothing less than to have his head stricken off, but Wamba simply ordered that it should be shaved. A shaved or tonsured head was the mark of one who had assumed monastic orders, which meant the man could not serve as king or chieftain, but must spend the remainder of his days in seclusion as a monk. Later an ambitious youth named Herwig, pursuing the overthrow of the king, administered a sleeping potion. While Wamba was under, Herwig shaved the crown of his head. As before, Gothic law was clear. Wamba could no longer be king, so he accepted this change and happily became a monk, abdicating the throne on October 14, 680, to live out the last 7 years of his life in seclusion from the world. Herwig became king in his place. Thus it was that Wamba the husbandman first became king and afterwards monk. In all his stations, farmer, king, and monk, he acquitted himself well and worthily, and his name has come down to us from the mists of time as one of those rare men of whom we know little, but all that little good. Ironically, it was Wamba's nephew, son of his sister Ariberga, Ergica, who married Herwig's daughter and became the new king at his father-in-law's death. Bibliography. Charles Julian Biscoe, Portuguese Pactual Monasticism in the 11th century. The case of São Salvador de Vaquerica, Estudos da Historia de Portugal, Homnegan de Oliveira Margues. Henry Bradley, The Goths, For the Earliest Times to the End of the Gothic Dominion in Spain, Chapter 33. 2nd edition, 1883, New York, G. P. Putnam Sons. Julian of Toledo, Historia Wambae Regis, in Mon. G. Hist. Scriptores Rerum Merovingicarum, v. 486-535, and cf. Dan, König der Germanen, v. 207-212, 217-18, R. Altamira, Cambridge Medieval History, 2, 179. Charles Morris, Historical Tales, The Romance of Reality, Spanish, 1898, Philadelphia, J. B. Lippincott Company. Manuel de Souza da Silva, Nobiliario das Jericas de Entraduro e Minho, Luiz Paulo Manuel de Menezes de Melo Vaz de São Paulo e Herança Genética de Dom Afonso I Henriques.